Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? I wanted to continue more on a video I made recently, right? Where I had talked about how, all of the evolutionary changes from the earliest animals all the way to humans, right, can all get started down at the cellular level, right? And mainly down at the molecular level, right? Um, because, right, we all start out in our earliest stages of development as a single cell. It's called a zygote, right? And within that zygote is the instructions for the whole entire body on the multicellular level, right? Even though it's a single cell. And so then that's how it's able to develop into our adult form eventually, right? And so every individual change along the way can first get started all the way down at the cellular level, right? Before it develops into anything on the multicellular level, the change can first start down at the cellular level, mainly down at the molecular level. And what I also talked about is how it can superficially seem as though that would not be the case, because a human zygote cannot on its own develop into what a human is like when they come out, right, without help from multicellular features that the mother's body has. And also you can't get a human zygote to begin with without multicellular features that both the father and mother have, right? But the thing is, this is why I broke down on the other video, right, is that for one thing, we see from other creatures with differing reproductive systems from ours, right, but still many developmental commonalities with us, many anatomical commonalities, right, that much of the steps of our evolution, right, were able to occur before our current reproductive system was ever in place, right? So like, for example, birds, they lay eggs, a very different reproductive method, right? And yet they still share much fundamental commonalities with us, right? In terms of their skeletal system, their nervous system, circulatory system, etc., right? So much of the earlier steps of these systems, right, eventually leading up to us, right, was able to take place before our current reproductive system was in place, right? And I talked about how the reproductive system itself is reducible, right? It can be broken down into a series of steps, each useful in its own right. And each change of the reproductive system would itself get started all the way down at the cellular level, because even the multicellular reproductive anatomy is the instructions for building that exist within the zygote, right? And much like is so often the case with showing the evolutionary reducibility of biological systems, the dependency that we have on our current reproductive system, right, can be evolved only later after that reproductive anatomy is in place. Other features which lead to the dependency on it can be evolved only later, whereas when it's first evolved, it just gives advantage, just improves the odds of the individual with the feature successfully producing offspring, but isn't absolutely necessary. Only later a dependency is evolved on the feature, right? And so every single change along the way, right, from the first animals to humans, right, can get started all the way down at the cellular level, right? But what I further want to talk about in this video, right, is that for the features that exist on the cellular level, much of these features, right, we don't actually need to account for evolutionarily, in order for all life on Earth to trace back to common ancestry, right? Because a whole lot of our anatomy on the cellular level is shared by all life on Earth, right? Whereas that could not be said of any of our anatomy on the multicellular level. Not all living things even are multicellular, and some living things that are multicellular evolved multicellularity independently from our lineage, the animals, right? Um, and so, whereas none of our anatomy on the multicellular level is shared by all life on Earth, much of our anatomy on the cellular level is shared by all life on Earth, right? And therefore, we do not need an evolutionary explanation for it in order for all life on Earth to share common ancestry. And it goes beyond the scope of what evolutionary theory attempts to explain, right? So, features like the phospholipid bilayer, the cytoplasm, ribozymes, DNA, all of those cellular parts, right, major parts of the cell, they're shared by all life on Earth, right? And so they predate the last common ancestor of all life on Earth, right? And so they don't need to be accounted for in explaining the universal common ancestry of life on Earth, right? And also with some of the features unique to the eukaryotic cell, right, like the nucleus, it's shared by all eukaryotes, right? And so it doesn't need to be accounted for in order for all eukaryotes to share common ancestry, even humans and plants, right? So that in of itself takes it very far back. Furthermore, with features shared by all life on Earth, right? In accounting for the origin of these features, right, we don't just have evolutionary processes like natural selection. There's also anthropic selection, the observer bias, that conscious observers like me and you could only find themselves somewhere where things came to exist in that way, right? Because it was necessary in order to eventually get things with brain and sensory organs. So things like me and you that are aware of our own existence. And so therefore there doesn't need to be a statistically plausible explanation for those things, right? Whereas for much of the later changes, right, it can't be accounted for by the observer bias. Like for example, the fact that birds are so good at flying, well, that has no like effect on whether or not me and you, the conscious observers, would find ourselves on a planet. We still could have found ourselves here if birds did not evolve the ability to fly, right? So that's why natural selection is needed to account for the like the fact that otherwise that would be statistically improbable, right? But then with natural selection it's not, right? But with much of the features on the cellular level, right, it without it we would not be here, right? And so the statistical improbability of it can be accounted for by the observer bias, right? There really is no limit to the number of opportunities within the cosmos for the factors to align in the right way. Creationists will oftentimes say like, oh, no, the odds are less than the total number of atoms in the universe. We don't know the total number of atoms in the universe. We don't even know if there's a limit. There's potentially infinite, even if not infinite, it could be any crazy large size. We don't know that the farthest that human technology can see is the farthest the cosmos goes. We don't know how far it does go. We don't even know there's a limit. Um, with features shared by all life on Earth, there is potential for some of it to have evolutionary explanations, right? But that it still is beyond the scope of what evolutionary theory attempts to explain, right? So it's not necessary for evolutionary theory to be true to explain that. It's not necessary in order for universal common ancestry of life on Earth to be true to explain that. As I said, the changes along the way, right, mostly get started down at the molecular level, right? And also worth noting is the commonalities even at the molecular level between groups of living things, right? Like chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives, they share about like 98.8% of their DNA with us, right? And so most of our genome did not even need to change since our last common ancestor with them. And it wasn't in a single step. The parts of it that did change, it didn't change in one single step either. And we do see nested hierarchical organization at the molecular level of living things, just as we do at the anatomical level, right? We see nested hierarchical organization of life at the molecular level, right? So mammals, right, are all more molecularly similar to each other than any of us is to like reptiles or birds, right? Tetrapods are all more molecularly similar to each other than any of us is to like fish, right? Etc., 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 right? And with the molecular instructions, even much of that is shared. Well, like the exact sequence, right, is shared by all life on Earth. So and when people are like wanting to try and like with the origin of life, they're like, oh well, what about, you know, when we don't know the physical mechanisms for like the formation, it's not like intelligent design, quote unquote, tells us anything about that. It's not in of itself a physical mechanism like molecules. That's not even something you could put together by hand. So, you know, and even like the environmental like circumstances necessary for it to be physically possible, right? Like the fine tuning of the environmental conditions, that in of itself we don't need a statistically plausible explanation for, because there's no limit to the number of planets there could even be. And even with the laws of nature themselves, there are some multiverse models that propose that that our universe's Big Bang was not the only one, and there are many other Big Bangs that happen potentially infinite, right? And in the early stages of a universe's formation, its natural laws form, right? And it could form differently in other universes with every possible variation of the fundamental constants of nature, right? Every possible variation, right? and we could only find ourselves wherever it worked out for our existence. So, all right, that's all for now. See you guys.